the cold steel of a customized Colt 1911 pressed flat against the mahogany desk, but Celeste's eyes were locked on the man who put it there. Declan Gallagher, the most ruthless syndicate leader in Chicago, stared at her trembling, swollen silhouette. "Tell me who the father is," the Mafia boss demanded, his voice a lethal, vibrating whisper that sucked the oxygen from the room. She'd hidden the truth for 6 agonizing months, but time had just run out. Celeste Higgins had spent her entire 32 years mastering the art of invisibility. It was a survival mechanism, one largely afforded to her by her physical size. In a world that worshipped sharp angles, hollowed cheeks, and women who looked like they could snap in a stiff breeze, Celeste was undeniably, unapologetically fat. She had broad, soft shoulders, thick thighs, and a heavy, rounded stomach that she typically draped in oversized cashmere cardigans and loose empire waist dresses. Society had a habit of looking right through women her size, treating them as part of the background scenery. For most of her life, Celeste had resented that invisibility. But for the last 6 months, it had been her greatest weapon. She worked as the senior forensic accountant for Gallagher Logistics, a towering glass and steel corporation situated in the wealthy enclave of Chicago's River North. On paper, it was a legitimate import-export empire. In reality, it was the meticulously clean front for the Gallagher crime syndicate. Celeste knew exactly who she worked for. She saw the millions of dollars moving through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, the sudden spikes in revenue that coincided with shipments at the port of Chicago, and the consulting fees paid out to ghost entities. But Celeste kept her head down, her practical leather clerks silent on the marble floors, and her mouth strictly shut. Her invisibility had worked flawlessly until the night of the winter gala at the Drake Hotel. It was supposed to be a standard corporate obligation. Celeste had worn a deep burgundy velvet gown, one of the few garments she owned that actually hugged her lush curves rather than obscuring them, and found a quiet corner in the Gold Coast room to sip her ginger ale. She hadn't intended to cross paths with Declan Gallagher. Declan was a phantom to most of the employees, a terrifying spectre of a man who ruled his empire with cold, calculated brutality. He was tall, built like a heavyweight boxer, with piercing, pale blue eyes and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was typically surrounded by towering bodyguards, and women poured into 6-inch Christian Louboutins. But that night, Declan had been bleeding. Celeste had retreated to the darkened archival library on the 2nd floor to escape the noise, only to find the Mafia boss slumped against a leather Chesterfield sofa, gripping his ribs, blood seeping through his tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. A rival faction had attempted a quiet hit in the valet tunnel. His security had neutralized the threat, but not before a stray blade caught him. Instead of screaming, Celeste had locked the heavy oak doors. She hadn't panicked. Using the first aid kit from the catering kitchen and her own torn velvet slip, she had cleaned and bound the wound with the clinical precision of a woman who had spent her life quietly fixing other people's messes. Declan had watched her the entire time. He hadn't seen a fat, invisible accountant. Through the haze of pain and adrenaline, he had seen a fiercely competent, deeply grounded woman. When her soft, warm hands had pressed the bandages to his torso, something volatile had ignited between them. The isolation of the room, the scent of her vanilla perfume, the stark contrast of his violent world colliding with her soft, nurturing reality. It had broken down his defenses. And, to Celeste's eternal shock, it had broken down hers. What happened on that leather sofa was desperate, raw, and earth-shattering. Declan had touched her with a reverence she had never experienced, his large hands mapping the heavy curves of her hips and the soft expanse of her belly, as if she were the most exquisite treasure he had ever claimed. For one night, Celeste wasn't invisible. She was the center of a dangerous man's universe. But when the dawn broke over Lake Michigan, reality had crashed back down. Declan's security team had breached the room, sweeping him away to a private underground clinic. Celeste had smoothed her ruined dress, walked out into the freezing Chicago morning, and convinced herself it was a fever dream. Declan was a king of the underworld. She was a plus-size bookkeeper with a penchant for Excel spreadsheets. They were an anomaly, a mistake. 2 months later, the nausea had started. Celeste had sat on the cold tile of her cramped bathroom in Logan Square, staring at the 2 pink lines on the plastic stick, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was pregnant, with the heir to the Gallagher syndicate. Panic had set in instantly. She knew what happened to women who got entangled with the mob. They became leverage. They became targets. And more terrifyingly, she knew what Declan would do if he found out. A man like him wouldn't let his bloodline walk away. He would take the child, and Celeste would be trapped in a gilded cage for the rest of her life. Or worse, deemed an unsuitable mother and discarded entirely. So she hid it. Her body type played perfectly into her deception. As the baby grew, Celeste simply bought larger cardigans. When her face grew a little fuller, her co-workers assumed she was just gaining weight, a topic no one dared bring up to a fat woman out of sheer social awkwardness. She blamed her morning sickness on a lingering stomach ulcer. She scheduled her appointments at Northwestern Memorial Hospital under a false surname, paying in cash she had meticulously saved. She thought she was safe. She thought she could quietly transfer to a branch in Seattle by her 3rd trimester and disappear into the rain. She hadn't counted on the karma of the Gallagher organization coming back to bite her, and she certainly hadn't counted on Ryan Mitchell. By month 6, the physical toll of the pregnancy was becoming impossible to ignore. Celeste's ankles swelled fiercely by mid-afternoon, suffering from severe edema that made her sensible shoes feel like vice grips. The baby, a boy, the ultrasound tech had cheerfully announced, was incredibly active, constantly kicking against her ribs. Her lower back ached with a persistent, grinding pain, and the heavy wool coats she wore to obscure her growing midsection in the warming spring weather were making her dizzy with heat. Celeste was exhausted, operating on a knife's edge of anxiety. She was fast-tracking her transfer, quietly packing up her apartment, and finalizing the Q2 audits. That was when she found the discrepancies in Ryan's accounts. Ryan Mitchell was a mid-level manager who handled the logistics for the Gallagher's South Side distribution hubs. He was a slick, overly cologned man who wore suits that were slightly too shiny and smiled with too many teeth. He had always treated Celeste with a thinly veiled disgust, making passive-aggressive comments about her diet or sighing loudly when he had to squeeze past her in the break room. Celeste had never liked him, but as she ran the numbers on the May shipments, her dislike crystallized into cold, professional dread. Ryan was skimming. He was inflating the cost of shipping containers and pocketing the difference, nearly $200,000 over 4 months. In the Gallagher organization, stealing from Declan wasn't a forcible offense, it was a fatal one. Celeste compiled the evidence on a secure flash drive, intending to drop it anonymously in the compliance lockbox. She wanted no part in the violent retribution that would undoubtedly follow. But before she could make the drop, her body betrayed her. It happened on a Tuesday. Celeste had been experiencing a bout of round ligament pain, so sharp it brought tears to her eyes. She had left the office early, taking a cab directly to the maternity ward at Northwestern. She hadn't noticed the black Mercedes trailing her. Ryan had been paranoid for weeks, knowing the auditors were crawling over his quarterly reports. He had been looking for leverage, any dirt he could find on the accounting team, to blackmail them into looking the other way. When he saw Celeste, the straight-laced, boring senior accountant, sneaking into the obstetrics wing, he thought he had struck gold. The next morning, Ryan cornered Celeste in the basement archives of the Gallagher building. The air down there was stale, smelling of ozone and old paper. Well, well, well. Celeste Higgins, Ryan purred, stepping out from behind a row of filing cabinets. He blocked her path to the elevator, his eyes dropping to her heavy, draped torso. "You've been keeping secrets." Celeste stiffened, clutching a stack of ledgers to her chest. Her heart began a frantic, terrified drumbeat. "Move out of my way, Ryan. I saw you yesterday," he said, taking a step closer. His gaze was predatory, gleaming with malicious triumph. "Maternity ward, under the name Celeste Hughes. You're knocked up. Who's the unlucky guy? Does he know his kid is being carried by the office whale?" Celeste's face burned with a mixture of humiliation and sheer panic, but she forced her expression to remain stoic. "My personal life is none of your business. Let me pass. It becomes my business when I need a favor," Ryan sneered, his tone dropping the false pleasantry. He reached out, tapping a manicured finger against the files she held. "I know you're looking at the Southside accounts. I need you to adjust the margins. Make the discrepancies vanish." "You want me to cover up your theft?" Celeste asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Ryan, Declan will kill you if he finds out." "Declan won't find out unless you tell him," Ryan hissed, leaning in so close she could smell the stale coffee and mints on his breath. "But if you don't fix those books by Friday, I'm going straight to HR. Actually, no, I'll go to the gossip mill. How long do you think you can keep your job here once everyone knows you're an unwed, pregnant liability? They'll find an excuse to fire you. Good luck paying for that bastard child without the Gallagher health insurance." Ryan thought he was being clever. He thought she was just a pathetic, lonely woman hiding a shameful secret from a random one-night stand. He had absolutely no idea that the baby he was threatening belonged to the apex predator of their world. "Friday, Celeste," Ryan whispered, stepping aside to let her pass. "Or the whole building knows." Celeste practically ran to the elevator, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The baby kicked violently in response to her spiking adrenaline. If Ryan exposed her pregnancy, the scrutiny on her would multiply 100-fold. People would start doing the math. They would start looking closer. And worse, if Declan's inner circle found out Ryan was trying to blackmail an employee, Declan would intervene personally. And Declan was already back in Chicago. He had returned from a brutal 3-month turf war in Palermo, Italy, looking leaner, darker, and more dangerous than ever. And since the moment his private jet had touched down at O'Hare, he had been looking for her. Celeste had felt his eyes on her in the lobby. She had seen his imposing silhouette lingering near the glass walls of the accounting